Good afternoon. Would you please welcome Dr. William Becker, Professor of History and the Chair of the History Department in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at the George Washington University.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see you here, and I'm here to welcome you to the George Washington University's Jack Morton Auditorium. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation, which is The Real George, Leadership and Character. This afternoon, we'll hear from three leading experts, a historian, an archaeologist, and a biographer, on perhaps unfamiliar aspects of George Washington as a leader and as a person of great character. To begin this afternoon's events, please join me in welcoming the 16th President of the George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp.
Thank you very much, Dr. Becker, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here on this beautiful afternoon on a typical February day here in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's discussion of the real George. We're going to be exploring George Washington's life in its full richness and complexity as a source of abiding inspiration and also as an abiding reminder of one of the deepest paradoxes in American history, the intertwining of those dreams of freedom and equality that define the nation from its inception, and of course the institution of slavery from whose effects the nation is still in the process of emerging. And George Washington had a very complicated relation to that history as someone who not only at the end of his life set his own slaves free. There was 316 of them living on his plantation at Mount Vernon at the end of his life, but in fact had adopted practices like not breaking up families, not selling and buying at a certain stage in his life, and in fact had integrated the Continental Army, and it was the first integrated U.S. armed force from that point, and actually the last until basically the Second World War era. So it's an interesting combination, and in some ways a complex issue to wrestle with as we continue to wrestle as a nation with our aspirations so deeply and strongly embodied in George Washington. And of course, as a university that bears his name, we're cognizant of that paradox, but we also are continually believed to live out his legacy of service to the nation. This event is part of our celebration of the anniversary of the birth of the university's namesake, and together with that, a kickoff to our celebration of our 100 years in Foggy Bottom. We actually arrived here in 1912, and this particular location was our third location as a university. It's also the year, just for your information, when the cherry blossoms arrived in the tidal basin. So we think that's a nice conjunction, but we also, it reminds us of everything it means to be both the university that grew out of George Washington's vision and the university that in many ways is in and of the District of Columbia, and so we're celebrating everything that means here to be in the nation's capital. I'd very much like to thank our co-host, George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate Museum and Gardens. I have a strong sort of personal affection for that institution, both because of its relationship with our university and because of the fact that in 2007, when I was inaugurated myself, and we had a modest but I think rather moving event for us on our Mount Vernon campus, because as most of you, all of you know, we do have a Mount Vernon campus as part of our university. It's up Foxhall Road from where we are. And on the occasion of my inauguration, I was presented with two of the sheep of the breed that George Washington raised on his own estate, Mount Vernon. And they, by coincidence, were named George and Martha. And they were presented to my wife, Diane, and me out Mount Vernon. There was a fife and drum corps that came up, and they marched up to us, and they are still not only alive, but thriving on our farm in Baltimore County, our sheep farm there. So we really appreciated that. And just yesterday, we had a very moving opportunity to go with quite a number of students and some of our faculty and others to a wreath-laying ceremony at General Washington's tomb. Now, whenever you talk about Mount Vernon's the Mount Vernon institution, the Estate Museum and Gardens, of course, it immediately brings to mind the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, really an extraordinary organization going all the way back to 1853, which was brought together on the eve of the Civil War, in part as a symbol of the unity of the nation, at least in the hope of keeping the nation unified, despite the separation that was already becoming evident. And part of the reason that it was a symbol of that was that it had representatives from every one of the then 30 states in the Union, and it has continued that tradition with a representative from each of the nation's states. It is the oldest national women's organization and also the oldest historic preservation organization. It's not only responsible for the fact that we have the Mount Vernon Estate still in existence today and in fact beautifully restored and just recently repainted, in fact in a new color that I think you'll find both charming and intriguing next time you visit. But it also, of course, was the beginning of a nationwide movement to preserve national landmarks, and that would never have happened without the creation of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Mrs. Barbara Lucas, who is the Vice Regent of Maryland for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. In 2006, Barbara Lucas retired as Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Corporate Secretary of the Black & Decker Corporation, where her responsibilities included business media relations, board and shareholder relations, worldwide subsidiary compliance and record keeping, corporate philanthropy, and community involvement. She had joined Black & Decker in 1985. During her time with the company, she also headed its worldwide investor relations. Mrs. Lucas was selected as one of the 100 women to watch in corporate America by Business Month and one of the top 100 women in Maryland, not once but 3 times in 1997, 1991, and 2001. It was in 2008 that she was invited to join the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association as Vice Regent representing the state of Maryland. She also serves on the Nursing Advisory Committee of the Greater Baltimore Medical Center. She has been a member of the Advisory Council of the Johns Hopkins University School of Professional Studies in Business and Education, and has served on the boards of the United Way of Central Maryland, the Baltimore Urban League, and the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mrs. Barbara Lucas. Thank you.
You would think I'm really old to hear all of that. It's a pleasure to see so many people here today. I was also listening to these wonderful remarks about the sheep. Our most famous animals at the moment are the turkeys that have been pardoned over the last couple of years, 2 of which last year, Apple and Cider, succumbed to stage fright. I think they didn't last too long, but we now have Peace and Liberty living large at Mount Vernon. So, as you heard, I am Barbara Lucas. I represent Maryland in the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and we're proud of our heritage. We were actually formed in 1853, and we've been maintaining the estate ever since. And since 1860, have kept it open continuously for millions of people every year. It's hard to believe that just 60 years after Washington died, his home was nearly lost forever. It certainly was a well-known and well-trafficked place even in its day, and yet the heirs to the estate couldn't keep it up, couldn't afford to keep it up, and didn't have Washington's skill as a farmer and entrepreneur. So the property was offered for sale to the federal government and also to the Commonwealth of Virginia. But with the Civil War looming and Mount Vernon's proximity to the nation's capital, both of those government entities turned down the offer, surprisingly. The family was negotiating with developers to subdivide the estate's 5 farms when a mild-mannered young woman from South Carolina declared, I'm sure very genteelly in her day, that if the men of America would not save our most historic site, that the women of America most certainly would do it. And that on its own was a pretty revolutionary idea in its time. And so she recruited women, as President Knapp said, and today The board continues to, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association continues to own and operate Mount Vernon. Many people are surprised to hear that it's not a government entity. Completely privately owned. We have never accepted a dollar of federal or state support. So in many respects, this is the people's house, even beyond some of our other icons. And at the moment, any state can have a representative. There are currently 27 on this board, each representing her state. So we are proud of what we do, and we work hard at what we do, and we try to stay efficient. I mentioned we don't take federal or state support, and along those lines, we like to think we're as entrepreneurial almost as George Washington was. In recent years, our mission has expanded considerably beyond the preservation of the estate to ensure that early American history in general and George Washington in particular continue to inspire current and future generations. So at Mount Vernon, we have worked hard over recent years to create meaningful learning experiences. We've returned the mansion and its surrounding landscape to its 18th century appearance, and that was just the beginning. We've added a 4-acre demonstration farm, reconstructed Washington's gardens and his blacksmith shop, and even his dung depository. So we're trying to get the whole thing authentically restored, ideally to that 1799 period when he died. Just over 5 years ago, we opened 70,000 square feet of new exhibit space comprising the Ford Orientation Center and the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center. And between these two buildings, I think we're telling Washington's story much more comprehensively than we have in the past to people of all ages. I hope maybe some of you have been there. I'd have to say that the main attraction of that complex is the Revolutionary War Theater, built to hold the attention of an 8th grade boy. And it's so exciting. The seats shake when the cannons are going off in the films, and during during the Valley Forge sequence, snow comes down on you, and it really makes that impression stick. 3 miles down the road from the mansion, we've built fully functional replicas of Washington's distillery and grist mill, also very, very much fun to watch. And now we think we have a guest experience unlike anything else in the country, and we were maintaining that, but turning our attention to more education outreach. Last April, we officially broke ground on what will be the equivalent of a presidential library for George Washington, scheduled to open in the fall of 2013. This will not be part of the national public or presidential library system, however, because it will be, again, privately owned and funded by the Ladies Association. As part of our plans for this, which we will call the Center for the Study of George Washington, we are aggressively acquiring original letters and books and duplicate editions of the 1,200 titles of books that were in his original library. We intend for this facility to attract scholars from around the world, and we're even building a guest house near the library where scholars can come and live and study and write in that inspiring environment. The center will also be a platform for a tremendous expansion of our educational outreach programs, distance learning opportunities, so that we can push this story of George Washington and his legacy out to audiences that might never be able to come to Mount Vernon, either nationally or internationally. So we're about to step things up considerably at Mount Vernon. And I think you would agree that if any president deserves this sort of recognition, it's our first and greatest. We think that his example of character and leadership is as important today as it was at least 200 years ago. I would argue maybe more. And it's inconceivable that we should allow him to disappear from our consciousness and our lives. So I'm really thrilled to see so many of you here tonight, and so many students in particular. And I hope that this special lecture, which features one of Mount Vernon's own experts, will make you even prouder of your own university's namesake. So on behalf of the Regent and the Vice Regents of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, I want to thank President Knapp and the staff and the faculty here at GW for partnering with us over the years in so many ways. We think there are many more opportunities for this sort of thing in the future, and I do invite you all to come see us at Mount Vernon anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to President Knapp. In a moment, I'll be introducing our speakers, but I want to reflect briefly on the significance of today's topic to the George Washington University. Most universities promise to build the character of their students and to help them develop their leadership skills, usually by recommending that they take courses in such subjects like history, but also philosophy, American studies, political science, literature, and so on. We at George Washington, of course, share such goals and offer many courses that are relevant to the study of character and leadership. But at this institution, in addition, we have the unique opportunity to focus on our namesake, to delve deeply and frequently into the legacy of character and leadership exemplified by the country's first president in venues such as today's symposium on the real George leadership and character. And now it's my pleasure to, mention two things. First off, I'm going to introduce our speakers. But I also want to mention that there's a table outside the doors that I hope you don't miss. Each of our speakers have some of their books for perusal and sale. And so please don't leave without taking a look more closely at our speakers' publications. The first person I'd like to introduce is someone well known to many of us at GW, and that's Ken Bowling. Ken has been the co-editor of the first Federal Congress project at the George Washington University. And his works include the documentary history of the first Federal Congress in a convenient 19-volume set. And he's also written a really splendid book on L'Enfant and the founding, really, of Washington, D.C. And it's called The Creation of Washington, D.C., The Idea and Location of the American Capital. Ken? Our second speaker this afternoon is Patricia Brady. She's a social and cultural historian who has published extensively on America's first ladies, women, free people of color, cemeteries, literature, and the arts in the South. Among a number of books, she's also published Martha Washington, An American Life. Pat? The third person to speak this afternoon is Dennis Pogue, who is the Vice President for Preservation at George Washington's Mount Vernon. During his tenure at Mount Vernon, Dennis has directed numerous archaeological excavations and managed several major restoration and preservation-related projects. The most extensive of these include reconstruction of George Washington's whiskey distillery, and also he worked on the interpretive display, Washington Pioneer Farmer. Dennis's topic, and he will be our first speaker, is George Washington as an entrepreneur.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here, and I am a graduate of this university. With a master's degree in American Studies, so there were jobs out there. I'm sure there still are. Let's hear it for the Dong Repository, which was one of my projects. And if you want a fun word to use at the cocktail party, that's also known as a storkerary. Storkerary. So remember that. Okay. My job here really is to talk about kind of Washington's, business activities. So I'm really going to be talking about, what he accomplished at Mount Vernon. And the subtext is that essentially over the last 25 years of Washington's life, as of course he took on such, paramount importance in the founding of the nation, is that he was really, almost everything that he did, I think, had two purposes. And certainly he was making money and he was doing a lot of things at Mount Vernon to be successful and all of that. But he also had an eye to the future. And so one of the remarkable things I think about a lot of his business activities at Mount Vernon is that he envisioned them as models for others, as models for American citizens to emulate, hopefully, for the success of the new nation that he was so instrumental in establishing. So that's kind of the subtext of my talk today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those specific aspects of the management and the development of Mount Vernon. But first we'll drop back just a little bit and talk about how he got there. Of course, Washington was not highly educated, did not have a college education. His formal education ended really when he was 15 years old. But he had enormous experiences at a young age that were incredibly important for him and helped him as he developed these later skills. He was a lifelong learner as well, something that I like to take from his character as well. But he was a surveyor as a young man. The Washingtons were not enormously rich, and as a younger son, he did not inherit a great deal of property. He inherited a small farm and 10 slaves at the age of 11 when his father died. And he went to work as a surveyor because he needed to find a way to make money. This gave him enormous experience. He spent a lot of time out in what was then the frontier of wild and woolly Western Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania and deep, dark places like that. But as a young man, he took on enormous responsibilities. He was leading a survey team out there essentially as a teenager and learned a number of life skills that were important for him. Washington also, you have to be ready when the opportunity comes, but Washington was remarkable in that he was the right man at the right time numerous times during his life. So for example, he was interested in a military career. His older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, had one, died sadly at a young age. Washington was kind of at the right time, the right place at the right time, and was made an officer in the Virginia Regiment. And he worked his way up and had a central role in the fighting for the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War. He, in fact, wanted to have a military career and was disappointed at the end of the French and Indian War. He actually lobbied to get a commission in the British Army. And we can all think how American history might have been different if he had been successful. But the British Officer Corps was not a meritocracy. You essentially needed money and you needed influence. And Washington didn't have enough of either of those. So he failed. And when he failed, he came back to Mount Vernon. Now, Mount Vernon had been owned by his older half-brother, who died, and Washington acquired this property in 1754. It was 2,000 acres at the time. He didn't actually own it until a number of years later when he fully inherited it. But from that point forward, essentially, Mount Vernon was his. And so when he came back from the war, he set about, becoming the best darn tobacco planter that he could be in Virginia. He was young, he was ambitious, he wanted to be successful, and he did everything that he could to do that. Now just talk a little bit about the Mount Vernon that everybody recognizes immediately, the house that you see on the right. This, of course, is the house as it developed over time. Washington inherited a much smaller structure, expanded it in 2 major building campaigns, and it really didn't achieve this appearance until the 1780s, in the years after Washington got back from the Revolutionary War. The plan that you see on the left that was drawn by an English visitor to Mount Vernon in 1786 shows the estate as it reached that final sort of fruition. And this was Washington's vision. Washington was his own architect. There were very few folks who were professional architects at the time, and so Washington served in that role. And this is very much emulating English fashionable ideas of architecture and landscape. Again, some folks are surprised that Washington led a war to break away from Great Britain. But culturally, of course, Washington always considered himself English, and even after the Revolution, it was English models that Washington and his peers were primarily following. So Mount Vernon is a great example of an Anglo-Palladian architectural design that was adapted for the use in this country, and the landscape as well. And Washington doesn't get enough credit for this, I feel, in that he really was the mastermind behind this. And the landscape and the house and the architecture all needs to be considered as an assemblage, because he was really creating this to be an ensemble that would, what do you know, be the house that he aspired to in his future. So that's the Mount Vernon that most of us know about. But now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. And this is a plan that shows how Mount Vernon developed over time. This is the original 2,000-acre tract that Washington inherited in 1754. By 1786, he had acquired all these additional parcels, and so it went from 2,000 acres to almost 8,000 acres over this period. And he was very, very canny about this. He was very single-minded. He was looking to develop a cohesive, efficient, integrated agricultural enterprise, and set about doing it in a very methodical way. And I need to have a little commercial here. Washington was fortunate in that he married Martha Washington, who happened to be the richest widow in Virginia at the time. My mom and I had this little conversation when I was 16, and she said, "Dennis, it's your choice. You can fall in love with a wealthy woman or not so." And I made the wrong choice, and George Washington made the right one. And so that money certainly was very, very important to him and allowed him to do a lot of the things that, frankly, if that money had not been available, he would not have been able to do. He also acquired upwards of 60,000 acres of land in the West, partly due to his surveying experience. He got a lot of land as bounties from his service in the French and Indian War. So he was very, very attuned to Western expansion. And that was one of the hallmarks of his presidency, actually, was looking to the West and trying to find ways to not only encourage American settlers to move to the West, but once they get there, to continue to be a part of the new United States, because he was fearful that they would spin off and lose that connection to the eastern states. So what did Washington do with this big enterprise? Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, he grew tobacco. Everybody was growing tobacco in Virginia. That's what people did to make money. And Washington jumped into that when he came back from the Revolution with a will, and for the next several years tried as hard as he could to grow the most and the best tobacco that he possibly could. And unfortunately, he was unsuccessful. The soil at Mount Vernon, frankly, just isn't very good. And it was particularly not good for growing the best quality of tobacco that you needed to get the best prices. So by the 1760s, Washington was sliding into debt. By 1766, he made a major decision, which was essentially to reinvent Mount Vernon and to give up growing tobacco at Mount Vernon and to substitute a variety of other pursuits. And the main thing that he chose was growing grain. So from this point onward, essentially Washington really was a farmer, because that's what he was growing. He was still growing it with enslaved laborers, but he was growing grain, wheat as his cash crop, and he ground it in his mill and exported it, other grains, corn and other grains as well, to support, as subsistence products for the plantation. He also diversified because essentially when he went from growing tobacco to grain, he didn't need as many field hands as he had previously. And so what he looked to do was to find other ways for those folks to make money for him. And so he diversified and became heavily involved in producing cloth, in fishing and blacksmithing, and a whole variety of activities. And he continued that throughout the rest of his lifetime at Mount Vernon. So agriculture was a hugely important part of what Washington was doing, and it was essentially really the first thing that I can point to that shows this transition from a personal to a much larger perspective. Because when Washington came back from the Revolution in the 1780s, he reinvented Mount Vernon again. He basically made huge changes to how agriculture was done at Mount Vernon. And he adopted a number of innovative ideas that were being promoted by Arthur Young and other agronomists, particularly in England and Scotland. And it's called the New Husbandry. And it was all about retaining the fertility of the soil, using crop rotation, fertilizers, draft animals, a whole variety of methods. And all of that was aimed at improving agriculture. Why was he so concerned about this? Well, for his own benefit, certainly. But he's very clear about it. He was interested in the United States becoming a granary to the world. He saw at that time, he envisioned that the United States, to be successful, needed to be a food exporting country. And so he knew that farmers are normally very conservative because the price for failure, of course, is so extreme. If you experiment with a crop and it doesn't work and you don't have a crop, then obviously you're in big trouble. And so Washington realized this and realized that it needed to be wealthy individuals, those who could afford to fail, needed to be the ones to experiment with these ideas, and hopefully by doing that would arrive at successful innovations that other folks could then use. And Washington was heavily involved with this. And from the time he came back from the Revolution in late 1783, for the rest of his life, even during his 8 years as president, he was heavily involved with these ideas and was working very, very hard to try to promote these new innovative approaches to agriculture. And that's one of Washington's, I think that just died. That's one of Washington's crop rotation plans, up on the left. And then to the right is the famous building, the Dung Repository, that Washington built in the 1780s to compost manure. That's actually a published depiction of a dung repository from the time period that was done by a friend of Washington's, and they may have, in fact, conferred on that design. Okay. So back to the plantation. This is a map that Washington drew of Mount Vernon from 1793, showing the 5 farms. And at this time, Washington had completely reorganized the plantation. The Mansion House Farm is where the Washingtons lived, down there at the lower right. Then there were 4 agricultural enterprises that are spread around the plantation, and between them, they comprised about 3,200 acres of land that was cultivated, and each one of those farms had a group of enslaved laborers working there, field hands under the direction of overseers. And so it became almost a military complex. And really Washington is trying to just improve the efficiency, the system that's being used at Mount Vernon. He implements a whole variety of new ideas on reporting and recording. All of this is trying to really get the operation on this level where he could really judge the success and then be able to move forward. Some of the specific activities, milling. Washington always had a grist mill, but in 1770 he built a new merchant mill to go along with his new expanded agricultural activities. That's the picture on the left. This is a reconstruction of that mill that's about 2.5 miles from the mansion that you can come today and see how it operates from April through October. And then in 1791, he paid to have a whole new system of milling retrofitted into the grist mill. And it was the idea of a fellow named Oliver Evans from Delaware. And it was a new system of milling. It was essentially a way that all the activities of the mill were powered from the water wheel. Back in the old days, the water wheel turned the stones to grind the grain, but everything else had to be done by hand. And so Evans's idea was that using elevators and shafts and pulleys and a whole variety of great Rube Goldberg kind of stuff, all of that stuff, would be powered by the water wheel. Washington, as far as we know, was the third person in the country to have this done, and he had it retrofitted into his mill. This was the ascendant milling technology, and this was the dominant milling technology for the next 70 years or so. And again, this shows, again, Washington's vision. Washington was not, unlike some presidents I might name, was not an agricultural ideologue. In other words, he didn't think that farming and agriculture was just inherently better than other ways of making a living. He didn't feel that at all. He understood that the United States was going to become an industrial nation. And so he was interested in looking at these different approaches and had no problem whatsoever in seeing them as being a part of the future of the nation. Okay, what everybody wants to talk about, and no, I didn't bring any samples, because everybody wants to know that, is that late in his life, Washington established a whiskey distillery, and it turns out that not only did he establish one, but it was the largest whiskey distillery, one of the largest at least, in the nation at the time. And so it was really a remarkable thing for Washington to get into late in life. In 1797, he only had a couple of years to live. Frankly, the reason was that he was looking for an easier way to make money. And he had a Scotsman named Anderson who came and was his plantation manager, and he sold Washington on the idea that he could make him a lot of money. And in fact, he did. And you can see the profits here in 1799. It was about $1,800 or 600 pounds. And that would have been the single most profitable aspect of the plantation at that time. And then finally, I want to mention this, is that, of course, Washington's plantation could not have operated without the labor of, in 1799, more than 300 enslaved African Americans. And Washington, over the course of his lifetime, initially embraced slavery, I think without any compunction whatsoever, but clearly over the course of his lifetime had changing ideas about that. And Washington was the only one of the 9 presidents of the United States who held slaves to free his slaves. And he did in his will, where he called for all of the individuals that he owned himself to be freed upon his death. And this was really, the will was really Washington's last public pronouncement. And again, like the farewell address, Washington's will was meant to be read by a wide audience. And this is, again, where he is learning his lessons at Mount Vernon. Slavery is one of them. He felt that he could not speak out against slavery as a public official, but he did what he could do privately, and he hoped that, again, that would be another model for his fellow citizens to follow by freeing the slaves in his will. And then, just finally, Washington was a tough guy, and he didn't know if we were going to make it, to be quite honest. He was doing the best that he could to give us models, to point us in the right direction. But in the last years of his life, he's always talking about the millions unborn. And we are the millions unborn. And was doing everything he could to get us in the right direction, but knew that it would be up to us. It would be up to us to make the right decisions to make sure that this country succeeded. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Patricia Brady, who is going to speak about Washington as a family man.
Good evening. I'm taking that look where you say, oh, he did so many important things. We think of him as a general, as a political leader, as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, as an emancipator. And yet, the one thing that strikes me most is that to most truly know George Washington, you need to know George Washington in his private life and in his family life. As a famous eulogy says, of course, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And it's always cut off there. But actually, the eulogy went on and said he was second to none in the humble and enduring scenes of private life. It goes on to say, too, that to know his private character gave a hint of what was so wonderful about his public virtues. And this is the George Washington that I like to look at and think about, the George Washington who made a partnership with his wife and had one of the most interesting relationships, I think, in early American history. Just recently, I've joined Loyola University as an associate so that I can give a class in biography, both reading and writing it, and talk about how biography should be done and what you should think about. In the course of that, of course, I've been reading a lot of things that either I haven't read or rereading things that I read 40 years ago. And Plutarch, one of the earliest biographers, has such an interesting take on the whole art and craft of biography. He says when you're dealing with famous men, which of course he did, that you can learn more about them by finding out a joke that they exchanged with their servants, what they did when they weren't served promptly at the table. All of the little minute details that you wouldn't think about are the ones that really make up the picture of the great men. And of course, Plutarch's lives are still really worth reading, and they're full of incredibly interesting detail. In the 19th century, certainly in part of the 20th, the idea that great men should be considered only in their public aspects, that talking about their private lives is somehow unfair or off base, that knowing what they said, how they talked to their wives at breakfast, for example, is not anything that any of us should know or care about. But I'm with Plutarch. I think the joke that someone makes with his servant or the way he behaves when breakfast doesn't come on time tells a lot about the man. One of the things in studying the whole relationship between George and Martha Washington that particularly struck me is that George Washington was one of the least patriarchal of important early men in America. You know, there's even a biography called Patriarch, of course, based on the idea of his running the nation. But he never pulled rank, so to speak. He never said, I'm the husband, and in that sense, I know best, and I will tell you what to do. That their relationship was always very even. Martha did what she wanted a lot of the time. When he said come, she waited till she was ready to come. When he said go, she waited till she was ready to go. Also, the whole question of money. By marriage, of course, Washington became rich through managing her dower property. And legally, of course, he could have said, I will do what I want to with this, and you mind your own business, little woman. But he always had the open view that she had good sense. He knew this. She had sense. She knew what she was doing. And so he frequently left things up to her. He would say, well, my dear, I have this idea and I have that idea, but you do whatever your own good sense tells you to do. His cousin and, for a time, his farm manager, Lund Washington, was completely shocked. He could not believe it. He wrote a very whining and complaining letter to Washington saying, Mrs. Washington, she has decided to take command of your papers, and she won't let me take them and put them in another room. She keeps the keys. She also came in, and some money had come in from various sales and whatnot, and she helped herself to what money she wanted without telling me how much it was or giving me an opportunity to tell her yay or nay. And that was the way they operated, that she knew she could do it, and he stepped back and understood that. One of the most interesting of all their letters is the letter that he wrote to her when he accepted the command of the non-existent Continental Army that belonged to the non-existent United States. This was 1775, after all. And he then wrote to her, and essentially the whole letter is a please don't be angry with me letter, the believe me, my dear Patsy. And again, it's not that, Mrs. Washington, I will be going to the field. It's, my dear Patsy, duty and honor require my acceptance. But then he goes on to say, I would enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad. If my stay were to be 7 times 7 years, I would never have as much enjoyment as with you. He also sent her a copy, since he was going into danger and he had no idea how it would come out. You know, for all he knew, he might be captured and hanged by the British the month after he got there. And so he sent her a copy of his new will and said, I want you to read this will, see if all its provisions are agreeable to you. If there's anything about it that you don't like or approve of, let me know and I'll change it. Again, that sense of partnership that was so incredible. He ends that really wonderful letter with, my dearest, I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time or distance can change. So that's, I think, part of what we would have seen if Martha Washington had not destroyed 40 years worth of the letters that he wrote to her and she wrote to him, that we'd have a much broader sense of what their relationship was like. But my feeling is that it was a lot more of the same, that he showed himself in private to be a man who respected women. He was a man who actually liked the company of women. He was never one to go down to the tavern with the boys, even when he was in the military, when so many of the officers acted like teenagers who were let loose and lived lives of quite a bit of dissipation. Not Washington. As soon as he took command, the first things he wanted to do was to get Martha and part of the family to come and join him. And as we know, for the whole time of the American Revolution, the 8 years or so, she was with him for 5 years of that time. Every year she went. She was there at Mount Vernon. She was there at Newburgh. She was everywhere. And of course, her job was to bring him his domestic enjoyments, to create the kind of home life, the quiet, comfortable, yet social life in which visitors were welcomed, but there was never any sense of sort of that European sense of propriety and stiffness and so forth, in the same way that Mount Vernon is a large, beautiful farmhouse. It's still a farmhouse for everything else it is. And their social life was very much the life of the restrained Southern farmer and planter. Education was one of the great regrets of Washington's life. He loved learning. He loved to read up on a subject, to learn everything he could know. And the fact that he had been unable to go to England to school because of his father's death, the fact that he had to go to work so very early, created a real sense of hardship in him, that he wanted the opportunity to go and do more. It was astounding to him and upsetting to him that neither his stepson nor his step-grandson had any interest in taking advantage of the multiple opportunities they had. They were both rich young men, and they were sent to the best schools in the nation, and yet neither of them ever showed any interest whatsoever. Their major interests were field sports and dancing and riding and generally socializing. They had very little interest in learning anything else. And the teachers would write and say, I don't know what we can do with these young men. You know, they simply won't do anything else. And Washington would talk to them and he would give them, say, you know, I never got to go to school and you need to do this. And they would say, and then they would drop out of school, as it happened. The interesting thing is that the one of the grandchildren that was most interested in learning was Nellie. As part of his approach to education, Washington really believed in the education of women. And the tutors who came and lived with them at the house taught both children. Nellie is the one who drank it up, who always did well in school. Nellie is the one who later in life, up into her 40s, was learning Spanish and was interested in all kinds of things. And that's the kind of curiosity that he liked. That's part of what Washington's dream for a national university, which of course George Washington University very much helps fulfill that dream. That's what he was looking at, the ability to be more and to know more. So I think if we look at Washington, we know he's the father of the country, but knowing him as the father of his stepchildren and step-grandchildren, as well as the hordes of nieces and nephews, tells us as much about him, perhaps, as some of his presidential policies. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Ken Bowling, who is going to talk about Washington as an extraordinary man.
I think my two fellow speakers have set me up nicely, and I want to acknowledge how much I've learned from Pat and Dennis over the last 25 or so years, and also the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, which has literally and figuratively dug up a great deal of new information, physical and otherwise, about Mount Vernon and about George Washington. I teach a class there on Monday mornings, and it's just a great experience to keep going back and back and back and seeing the seasonal changes and also seeing the changes that I've seen there since I was a little boy and went there in the 1950s. George Washington is often called a great man, but I prefer to call him an extraordinary man because, in part, it contains the word ordinary and reminds us that he was a human being. One of the many things about him that was extraordinary was that he was a visionary, not a utopian visionary, but a realistic visionary. Well, except when he was blinded by Potomac fever. Potomac fever was a, I sometimes say delusion-inducing, but I thought I wouldn't say that today. But it's an obsession with the economic potential of the Potomac River that had infected his family since his great-grandfather was shipwrecked on its shores in the 17th century. I want to speak briefly about a couple of aspects of his vision for the United States. But before I do that, I want to mention a couple of things that he accomplished during his lifetime. One of his greatest gifts to the country was the establishment of civilian control of the military. Like all the founders, he knew history, and like them, was committed to the creation of a nation that avoided the military takeovers that had plagued Western Europe from Caesar to Cromwell. The return of his military commission to Congress in December of 1783 wrote that policy into American constitutionalism. Another way that his influence and vision and leadership affected the United States concerned separation of church and state and religious toleration. Students of history, once again, the founders knew, they were well aware that Christians had spent many decades killing each other over their religious interpretations of Christianity. To succeed, the United States must become a secular state. This did not mean that the founders did not consider religion important to a stable society. George Washington had no problem with a national church at the federal Capitol, as long as it was non-denominational and not part of the federal government. Jefferson is often credited with this idea of separation of church and state, as if he were the only founder who believed in it. While Jefferson may have been the most outspoken on the issue, Washington is equally as important as Jefferson, because as the first president of the country, he set the precedents regarding religion and the federal government, particularly in the presidency. The precedents he set in matters of religion favored separation of the two institutions. Whenever he traveled, he attended the nearest church, Catholic or Protestant, of any denomination. His letter to the synagogue at Newport, Rhode Island is famous, but it is only one of several that he wrote in support of a religiously inclusive society. Consequently, while attending a wreath-laying at Mount Vernon yesterday, I was shocked to hear him accurately quoted in a state paper as referring to, quote, the divine author of our blessed religion. How could such a blatantly Christian remark come from such a religiously tolerant man? Then I realized that as in many other things, such as slavery, one of his qualities as a leader was growth in his thought process and what he thought about things. But that remark was made in 1783. 6 years later, as President of the United States, he would not have made that remark, and it was indeed when he began to publicly set out to show his support for any religion that he did not believe that the United States had to be seen as a Christian nation. And in fact, there's a famous letter that John Adams, the second president, wrote to the Sultan in Morocco, saying, the United States is not a Christian nation. And it was very important to the founders. Finally, not finally, but almost, his vision, finally his vision. His vision first for the capital of the United States. The city, not the building. Obviously, he knew it was going to be named after him. He believed in a grand national capital, and he shared the details of his vision with Peter Charles L'Enfant, the French-born American who incorporated them into his plan. But Washington's ideas looked too far into the future when Washington knew the federal government would prevail over the states, and that the United States would be important on the world stage. Consequently, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson threw L'Enfant's plan, along with Washington's ideas, into the gutter. The city of Washington functioned merely as a seat of federal government until after the Civil War, when the Republican Party made its reconstruction, both physically and symbolically, part of the reconstruction of the South. Washington, D.C., is now what George Washington envisioned it, except for the traffic, I think we agree on that. One of the institutions that he wanted to see here was a national university that would act to bring future leaders of the nation from all over the country together, bring them here so that they would overcome the state and sectional prejudices that so crippled most other political leaders of his generation. He first became enamored with the idea in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 while presiding over the Federal Convention. After he became the first president, he recommended a national university in almost every annual message he gave to Congress, from his long, undelivered inaugural address to his last annual message. But Congress was composed of state delegations who would have no national university. And so he gave up on Congress and turned to the American people directly. His farewell address, despite repeated attempts by Alexander Hamilton, who drafted much of it, contained strong language in support of a national university. And every time Hamilton would strike it out, Washington would put it back in. And Washington brought it up again in his will, which was published in a pamphlet form and circulated widely throughout the United States. Not only did he stress the importance of the institution to the survival of the Union, but he also provided an endowment for it in his will, should it be created. You will be pleased to know that as president, he favored its location in Foggy Bottom and even purchased lots at the site that he and the city commissioners wished to build, where they wished to build it. Finally, George Washington envisioned a multiracial society, free from the institution of slavery. You all know that he stated his opposition to slavery and freed his slaves in his will. Fewer know that he provided an endowment in it for the welfare of those former enslaved workers who were children, elderly, or infirm. The nation he envisioned would be inclusive of them as well as of the Native American population. As an aside, American Indians have never had a better friend in the presidency than George Washington. But I want to go further than what people have said about George Washington and slavery and say a little more. I want to call him the most important abolitionist of his generation. Not the most vocal, that wasn't his way, but the most important because of who he was and the public way in which he freed his slaves and stated his opposition to American slavery. It was the first provision of his will, after providing for Martha Washington and any small debts, and believe me, they were small, that he had not yet paid. It was his final opportunity to influence the people that he had led from being subjects of a king to citizens of a republic. They would pay a high price for not following his leadership on this issue. The word abolitionist did not become common in the United States as a term to denote people who favored the abolition of slavery until well into the 19th century. But that does not mean that someone who publicly stated his opposition to slavery and freed his slaves at the end of the 18th century was not an abolitionist. And that is what George Washington, the namesake of our university, was, an abolitionist. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, and there will be two people with mics. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'd like to have you give us your name and also tell us what your affiliation is.
Hi, my name is Alex Wisnan. I'm a freshman in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences. I intend to major in psychology. I was just curious as to where Washington actually governed from. We know the White House wasn't built when he was ushered into the presidency, so I was curious as to where it was that he governed.
Washington first governed, and I don't really look at it that way since I'm a believer in congressional supremacy. Congress inaugurated Washington as president. He didn't inaugurate himself. He and Congress governed originally in 1789 and 1790 from Wall Street, New York City, Lower Manhattan. And from then, 1790, to his end of his term in 1797 in Philadelphia.
Could I just add something to that, which I think a lot of people don't realize, was that the Washingtons rented the presidential mansion. You know, they were living in rented houses throughout their presidency, and his office was in the house. And so the secretaries lived there, people who had government business came to the house and went upstairs to the office. So it was a very small and personal kind of environment.
My name is Bill Johnson. I'm with the Department of Energy and just have a renewed interest in history, so that's why I'm here. I'm curious why my question is, why do you think that George Washington's estate was financially successful when at the end of Jefferson's life and Madison's life, they were broke and the families were forced to sell them off? And then a quick second, since you've mentioned that he freed his slaves, were they actually freed? I'm under the impression that not all of them were actually freed if you could address that too. Thank you.
Sure. Well, the second one first is that it was a complex, very complex situation where Martha Washington brought slaves to Mount Vernon, from her husband's estate. And so legally, they were not, George Washington did not own them, and they were entailed to the Custis estate. So as early as the 1780s, Washington privately is talking about his desire to get rid of slavery at Mount Vernon. But one of the challenges that he had is that he didn't own all the Mount Vernon slaves, yet the two groups had intermarried. And so he could not free all of them. He could only free the ones that he owned. And the problem with that is that then would break up the enslaved families. And Washington is very eloquent on this topic early on, where he says that one of the worst things about slavery, among many, is the breakup of the families, that the family units just have no legal standing. And so early on, he makes that statement that I'm not going to do that. And so as he is thinking of ways to deal with the enslaved community at Mount Vernon, hoping to free all of them, what he had to try to do was find a way to get enough money to pay the Custis estate for the value of the Custis slaves so that he could then free all of them at one time, which was his goal. And he tried this in the 1790s, actually tried to sell some of his western lands in the hopes of raising enough money to be able to do that. It was unsuccessful. And so when it came down to it at the end, all he had left, in his opinion, was the ability to free his own slaves, and knew that by doing that, it was going to do what he hated, which was going to break up the families. But that is, in fact, what happened. And the first question was, why was Mount Vernon successful? Well, because he was good at it, and those other guys weren't very good at it. Thomas Jefferson, he liked to fiddle around with ideas, but he wasn't really a committed manager like Washington was. And maybe it's because of Washington's military experience, but I think it's just his entire character. He was very detail-oriented and very committed to these things. And so, Washington really worked hard at this, and even while he was gone, because of course he was absent from Mount Vernon for two major spans of time, during the Revolution and then again during his presidency, and Mount Vernon suffered because of that. But there's great letters in the papers of George Washington that he writes back to his plantation manager. He's outside of Boston, and he's writing back and talking about the siege with the British, what are we going to do, we're running out of ammunition, blah, blah, blah. By the way, how are the lambs doing? Have you cleared the back 40 like I told you to? And so it's very clear that Mount Vernon was always, foremost in his mind, and it showed. And he was a very effective manager.
Hi, my name is Lori Panosian. I'm a junior in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences. My question is, I'm curious about your insight into how George Washington's legacy should be introduced to the youngest students in America, and how the origins of the stories of him chopping down the cherry tree and what is normally told to these students came from, where they started, how they were perpetuated in our history classes.
I think in history classes, but also in biography classes, that one of the most valuable things you can teach anybody is that because it's printed in a book doesn't mean it's true. And that how do people write a history or a biography? Everything involves choices, it involves shaping, it involves putting it together, and in some cases it involves telling outright lies to suit the whim of the writer who wants to remake the person in the image he really wants. I think it can really be a lesson for even young kids in ways to look at the truth and try to figure out what it is.
But none of us up here did that, by the way.
I want to know about you, Dennis.
Oh, thanks.
At this stage of my career, I'm struggling with trying to accept the fact that maybe the cherry tree story is true. Parson Weems, who put it in his biography, didn't say that Washington chopped down a cherry tree. He said that he girdled it. And I could see that. And when his father said, George, did you do that? I'm sure he didn't say, I didn't tell a lie, but what he did was to tell his dad that he did do it. And so after saying hundreds of times, about this terrible false story, I'm beginning to wonder.
Well, but Ken, Weems only did that in one of the later editions. The earliest editions, which incorporated stories he heard in the neighborhood of Fredericksburg and all that, did not include it. The cherry tree comes, sort of like, oh, and by the way, a new story is putting in. It's part of the way of looking at the text, seeing in what order it comes. So no, he didn't cut it down.
He didn't.
Or girdle it.
Don't backslide, Ken. But of course, what's the real significance of Weems? And this goes back to your question about legacy. How do we remember these people in the past? And what Parson Weems was trying to do, of course, was to give Washington sort of a human backstory. Because, even then, and as I think, Pat mentioned, or somebody mentioned, the story of his childhood, we don't have a lot of information. But of course, Washington became such an icon so early. During his life, of course, he had taken on this incredible, aura. And so what Weems is doing is he's responding to his audience. He's trying to, come up with stories that allow his public to make a connection with George Washington. And even then, he's trying to find that human side that we can all sort of embrace and engage. And I think that that's the thing about Washington, and that unfortunately, people think they know stuff about Washington. What they know, half of it's not right. And the other half is kind of, it's important, but it's not the really interesting stuff. There's so much to Washington. To get to know Washington more is to really appreciate him more. The more you learn about him, the more you understand his character and all the things that he did, he comes off as an incredibly dynamic, interesting character, much more so than sort of the cardboard images that so often portray Washington.
I think also in answer to your question, we really need to put George Washington back into the classroom. The number of people who really don't really know anything about him other than the dollar bill astounds me, young people. And one of the programs that Mount Vernon has is actually to provide portraits of George Washington for classrooms in America. When I was a child, I think at least at the beginning of my elementary school career, every classroom had a portrait of George Washington. Now, that was only 65 years ago.
None of this is to say that George Washington was perfect. I mean, perfection is boring. It's the fact that Washington was a lifelong learner. He did learn he made mistakes. His military career can arguably, be categorized as kind of one step forward, two steps back a lot. And so it's not that he, was just completely exemplary. And that's good for us because that allows us to make connections with this person in a way that I think is helpful to us. And so Washington really provides, all of these things that I think, is so important. And I, of course, agree completely with Ken. We need to tell that story.
Well, and the way that he learned and developed. I mean, that does resonate with young people. Yes, you just screwed up. Guess what? Everybody does. What can you take away from it, and how can you use it in where you're going forward?
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Yosef Ezekilov. I'm a senior at George Washington, majoring in international affairs. You mentioned Washington's role as an abolitionist because he freed his slaves at the end of his life. My question is, how big of an impact did that really have, given the fact that the institution of slavery flourished throughout the 19th century and the fact that the U.S. was one of the last countries to uphold the institution?
As I said in my remarks, his country did not take his advice and paid a very high price.
Well, even among his family. We mentioned that there are these two groups of slaves, so the Washington slaves and the Custis slaves. And Martha Washington actually elected to free the Washington slaves before Washington called for it. They were supposed to be freed upon her death, because George Washington assumed that he would die before her, and he didn't want her to observe the painful sensations, that's his term, for the breakup of the families. And Martha Washington decided to accelerate the terms of the will, and in fact, those 123 individuals were freed on January 1st, 1801. And so it was a very complex, very difficult situation. But the Custis slaves were passed on to the Custis heirs and are lost to history. And so Washington's will, as Ken said, the statement about slavery was right up there at the beginning. And it was a very clear and powerful statement. And he knew that his will was going to really be his last public document. And it was written in that way. And he did what he could. Unfortunately, it did not take.